Now we turn to Western Christianity. In the West, the church was a distinctly political institution. It was the papacy, really, more than anything else, that held the West together, and there was no great emperor in the West like there had been in the East. The church in the West owned more land than any other institution in Europe. Its bishops were also lords, and it had direct control over many areas of life, including birth, marriage, care for the poor, the lending of money, the tithe, or taxes, and death. The inevitable result of this was that there was constantly conflict between the spiritual or ecclesiastical authorities and the political or secular authorities. In fact, in Italy, the lands controlled by the papacy, known as the Papal States, which you'll see on the map, made up their own independent state. Those secular authorities were growing stronger. The secular authorities were growing stronger, however, because of the growth of a market economy. And this is the beginnings of what later we might call capitalism. And that was carrying with it a rising bourgeois class, or what we might consider a middle class between the nobility and the poor. The bourgeois were especially concerned for economic prosperity and therefore for peace and stability. And to do so and to protect their own rights, they tended to support stronger central governments. It was also at this time, during the 13th and early 14th centuries, that a new philosophical and theological doctrine of rights was beginning to be accepted by scholars throughout Western Christendom. I'll talk more about that later. And so you begin to see here the emergence of what there hadn't been in Western Europe for quite some time, and that's the emergence of stronger nation states. Not as strong as they'll be later, but nevertheless distinctive nation states such as England and France. The Holy Roman Empire, centered on what's now Germany, was technically unified, but it was actually very weak, and Spain and Italy were also very divided. Now, crucial to understanding the Western Church at this time is the theory that's known as the two swords theory. This was the medieval theory of the way in which church and state, or spiritual and secular power, were supposed to relate to each other. However, two swords theory was bitterly contested. In 1302, Pope Boniface VIII issued the papal bull Unum Sanctum, and this bull represented the strongest claims that the papacy ever made to something like papal monarchy and what came to be known as the hierocratic theory. As the vicars of Christ, or the representatives of Christ, the popes claimed that Jesus had given them all authority, both spiritual and temporal, and that they merely delegated temporal authority to secular powers. And the reason it's called the two swords theory is because they used as a partial basis for this the passage where the disciples give Jesus two swords. They say, "Here are two swords," and he says, "It is enough." And theologians and canon lawyers and popes built up these claims over time. So let me read to you from Unum Sanctum, because it's an important document. It gives you a sense of what the Western Church, the popes, were claiming at this time. It says this: "Both then are in the power of the Church, the material sword and the spiritual. But the one is exercised for the Church, the other by the Church. The one by the hand of the priest, the other by the hand of kings and soldiers, though at the will and sufferance of the priest. One sword ought to be under the other, and the temporal authority subject to the spiritual power. For while the apostle says there is no power but from God, and those that are ordained of God, they would not be ordained unless one sword was under the other, and, being inferior, was led by the other to the highest things. Therefore, if the earthly power errs, it shall be judged by the spiritual power. If a lesser spiritual power errs, it shall be judged by its superior. But if the supreme spiritual power errs, it can be judged only by God, not by man. Therefore we declare, state, define, and pronounce that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. And so these are incredible claims that the Pope is making to essentially have the right to rule all things, ultimately in both church and state. And the only person you can appeal a decision of the Pope to is God himself. But since the Pope is God's representative, the Pope is supreme. The popes claimed the right to adjudicate all disputes and controversies, and they could enforce their decisions by excommunicating someone, which prevented someone from taking the Lord's Supper and was seen as essentially condemning someone to hell, or interdiction, in which an entire area was prohibited from celebrating the Mass. These were papal claims, but they're much stronger in theory than they were in reality. There was always strong opposition to these claims from secular authorities, especially the nearest great rivals, France and the Holy Roman Empire. Theologians like John of Paris, who taught at the University of Paris, articulated a different view of two swords theory, in which the two swords are mutually corrective, and in which popes can be opposed by lay rulers, kings, princes, or by a church council. And in practice, the church was involved in a constant tug-of-war with secular authorities and even with regional churches over all manner of innumerable disputes. And the reality was that countries like England and later Spain and certainly France had a fair bit of control over their own churches. They really didn't do whatever the Pope wanted them to do, and he wouldn't have dared tell them everything what to do in practice. And a whole tradition emerged with its own scholars and theologians to rival the popes, known as Caesaropapism. And this argued that political rulers were the proper rulers of Christendom, and that it was their task, just like the kings of Old Testament Israel, to supervise the church. They denied that they got their authority from the Pope and insisted that it came directly from Christ. And it tended to be these sorts of scholars and princes who were the first to condemn the popes as antichrist. Later, that becomes a hallmark of the Reformers and the Reformation, but there was a long tradition of that, and it went back to this opposition of local political rulers and their scholars against the claims of the papacy. But the reality was that both sides tried to maintain a hierarchical view of the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. The popes claimed that the spiritual was over the temporal. The Caesaropapists claimed that the temporal had authority over the church. And in between these was a whole spectrum of different positions with more or less nuance. And Gonzalez goes into detail on how this contest unfolded, especially between the papacy and France. Pope Boniface's successor, Clement V, actually moved the papacy to Avignon in France, where it would function under the thumb of the French crown. So the reality, ironically, is that right at the moment when the papacy is making its strongest claims, it's actually more under the thumb of the French crown than ever. And there the popes at Avignon came to be known for their pomp and luxury, and this became known as the captivity of the church, which later would be called the Babylonian captivity of the church, since it lasted about 70 years. There was further controversy when Pope John XXII attacked the Franciscan movement. The Franciscans were a monastic movement who rejected the church's wealth and pomp and devoted themselves to poverty and care for the poor. Because they wanted to be poor, they entrusted all their property to the papacy. They said, we don't own anything. The papacy holds our things in trust. But John attacked the Franciscans and repudiated the papal ownership of their property, thus forcing them to own it for themselves, and this became a bitter dispute. One of the Franciscans' defenders was a philosopher and theologian known as William of Ockham. And Ockham agreed with their call that the church should practice poverty. He also came as close as anyone to articulating a very balanced view of the relationship between secular and spiritual authority. In some ways, Occam's view of this prefigured what would later become Protestant two kingdoms theology. Occam went so far as to call Pope John a heretic, which got Occam excommunicated, but he was protected by the King of Bavaria. Another scholar critical of the papacy was Marsilius of Padua. In a book called Defender of the Peace, he defended a strong version of Caesaropapism, in which the government had authority to regulate the church, even in matters of doctrine and discipline. He argued that the church's authority was merely to teach and to instruct, and that the church didn't even have the right to control excommunication. Marsilius was very much on the other extreme, and he was also excommunicated by the papacy. It was in the midst of this crisis that another crisis emerged in Europe. Declining economic conditions led to food shortages that weakened people, and that weakened them to what became known as the Black Death that you see powerfully represented in this picture, along with just the general state of crisis that Western Christendom was in at this time. It's believed that the Black Death was carried by Mongols who were sieging a Genoese trading post in the Crimea on the Black Sea in 1346. Genoese refugees carried it to Constantinople and from there to Western Europe, and it became the deadliest event in European history, killing as many as 1/3 of the European population in just 5 years, between 1348 and 1353. The result was massive economic and political disruption. Markets were destroyed, unemployment soared, and people rioted. It devastated European morale and fostered an obsession with sin, judgment, death, and hell that would characterize Western Christianity for centuries, and that we often take for granted as sort of the background to the Reformation. It led to a new emphasis on purgatory, doctrine of purgatory, especially in the North, the idea of a temporary place where Christians would have their sins purged from them under sort of hellish conditions, and on the need to pile up reparations for sin or do penance, and to do this by the use of indulgences, a system in which the church gave penitent people the partial remission of temporal sins to get them out of purgatory more quickly. Such indulgences could be purchased, and they became as pervasive as modern-day lottery tickets. Another way to get rid of sins, temporal sins, and help yourself in purgatory was to make a pilgrimage or to express devotion to relics. And all of these things, especially in Northern Europe, were greatly enhanced and fostered by the cataclysmic event of the Black Plague and the sheer death and destruction that it brought. The Black Death also spurred the flagellant movement, in which the groups of people would basically parade around Europe, inflicting violence on themselves as penance for sin. You can see these people are whipping themselves in the back as they walk, and they're carrying the crucifix, and this is supposed to be them, trying to atone for their sins. Sometimes these flagellants lashed out in violence against the Jews, provoking widespread anti-Semitic pogroms. In parts of Central Europe, whole Jewish communities were destroyed. It's complicated why this was, but when Europe is in a state of crisis, many people blame the Jews for bringing down God's judgment on Europe. Pope Clement VI, however, actually condemned the flagellant processions in 1349 precisely because of their link with anti-Jewish violence. So the church saw the problem in a lot of these things and it tried to stop them. While all this was going on top of it all, in 1337, a brutal war broke out between England and France over who inherited the French crown. That would last more than 100 years, and therefore became known as the 100 Years' War, and would drag half of Europe into its violence. Its most famous episodes include the teenage girl Joan of Arc responding to visions from God and being called to lead the French armies to victory. This is a famous painting of Joan of Arc that my wife loves, having spent a lot of time looking at the original in New York. But Joan of Arc was a young girl who received these visions and then led the French armies to victory over the English, but was eventually killed by the English. And the 100 Years' War is also made famous by the Battle of Agincourt, which is featured in Shakespeare's play Henry V. The English and the Holy Roman Empire came to see the papacy as their enemy, since it was obviously controlled by the French. The papacy at this time was also associated with various problems, such as absenteeism, where bishops appointed by the papacy would not even be present where they were supposed to be governing the church, or simony, which was the sale of ecclesiastical positions, or pluralism, in which a bishop might hold multiple ecclesiastical posts at once, and nepotism, in which a person would appoint their relatives to ecclesiastical office. And some considered the plague, the Black Plague, a judgment from God for the papacy's corruption. Now, the result of all this was what became known as the Great Western Schism. A woman named Catherine of Siena helped bring the popes back from Avignon to Rome. As a young woman, Catherine had experienced visions of Jesus joining her in a mystical marriage and calling her to serve other people. She devoted her life to helping the poor and the sick and to contemplation. She gathered and taught a circle of disciples around her, both men and women, and in 1370 she launched a campaign to bring the papacy back to Rome, leading a pilgrimage through Italy. And it succeeded in 1377 when Gregory XI returned to Rome, thus ending the Babylonian captivity of the church. After he died, his successor, Pope Urban VI, alienated many cardinals by his policies, and they declared him a false pope and elected a new pope, Clement VII, who went back to Avignon. So that meant that soon there were two popes, one in Rome, free from the French crown, the other in Avignon, under the French crown, and each had a competing college of cardinals. And cardinals are basically just papal officials who help them to govern the church. Because the 100 Years' War was going on, Europe divided its support between these different papacies along lines that basically reflected the different sides of the 100 Years' War. So France, Scotland, Castile, Aragon, those are in Spain, and some local leaders in Italy, as well as some local leaders in the Holy Roman Empire, supported Pope Clement in Avignon, while their opponents, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Scandinavia, Flanders, Hungary, and Poland, supported Pope Urban in Rome. And so Europe divides right down the middle in this great schism that's being fought on the battlefield and between various bishops and popes and colleges of cardinals. Europe's top theological faculty, the University of Paris, tried to find different ways to end the crisis, but there were too many competing interests and the schism dragged on. And don't forget that while all this is happening, the Turks are coming closer and closer to Constantinople. They're taking more and more of areas around it, like Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and the Eastern Church is desperate for aid, but the Western Church is simply too divided and two at odds with itself to help them.